Welcome to class. This is Introduction to Political Ideas, and I'm Ken Hicks. And our topic today is liberalism. We spent some time last class just kind of discussing the origins of liberalism, how liberalism emerged as a result of a number of historical factors, including sort of the erosion of feudalism as a viable system of political and economic and social organization. A variety of other factors, the Renaissance, the Protestant Reformation, all of these things created an environment where both liberalism as a way of approaching politics, and also, again, kind of more Republican and democratic ideas begins to circulate in the 17th, 18th, and into the 19th centuries. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the relationship between liberalism and capitalism. Then we're going to discuss liberalism in the 19th century, and then we're going to talk about the great schism that emerges in the later part of the 19th century between classical liberals and what we would today describe as welfare liberals. So first and foremost, it's important to keep in mind that liberalism really does emerge as an ideological defense of free trade and of capitalism generally. So early liberals were, again, foremost of their commitments. If you remember what our discussion of John Locke, the primary initial emphasis for early liberals was the commitment to economic liberty and to the protection of private property. So obviously they opposed all systems of ascribed status. Simply put, they opposed feudalism and the idea of nobles, priests, and serfs because it was economically inefficient. They also opposed early Christian prohibitions on usury, which was, again, a form of money lending. They believed, again, that money is the medium of economic relations, and money needs to be available. They were also opposed to mercantilism, the idea that governments would impose in international trade, would intervene in international trade in such a way as to promote their own nation's power. The colonial system, for example, was really the rationale for it was that England, France, and Spain would develop their own colonies, get the raw materials from those colonies, and then be able to exploit them and sell the goods back to the colonists in sort of a closed feedback loop, if you will, really kind of minimizing foreign trade with other countries. The problem with mercantilism, simply put, is that it is economically inefficient and it doesn't provide the kinds of goods that people want. For example, many people in England wanted wine, and they could only get wine really from France and Spain. England did not produce enough wine to make it really viable to provide to all people who wanted it. So a lesson that we probably need to relearn is that economic nationalism can oftentimes come at a high price. Now that doesn't mean that you can't, as a government, invest in certain important aspects of your economy. Every modern economy, every nation state needs to have an industrial base. Otherwise, you are reliant for people. Think about what happened during the COVID crisis when we found ourselves facing terrible shortages of personal protection equipment, PPE, for our health professionals. In many other countries, they had similar kinds of shortages, and it resulted in really the prostration of their own healthcare systems, because the people that were treating the folks that were coming in sick with COVID were themselves contracting COVID, and many of them were dying. And so early capitalism and liberalism with it naturally formed a hostility to the ideas of monopolies, right? The idea that either private or public enterprises could establish the sole distribution of a particular good. And so one important group of people that came around were what were known as the physiocrats, and their slogan was this phrase, laissez-faire, laissez-passer. which simply means let it be, leave it alone. So liberalism and many of the classical economists too, which we'll talk more about in a minute, were convinced that economic exchanges should fundamentally be private affairs that may be facilitated by government. And of course, remember, money is a government creation. But primarily the economy should be operating between private citizens, exchanging goods for mutual benefit. You have this argument that self-interested behavior produces public benefits. And again, this was the physiocrats were a group of French classically trained economists. Their view of government interventions were that they were not against all interventions, just the dumb ones. I'm kind of paraphrasing Barack Obama there. One of the kind of classic works of economics that many exerted wide influence, particularly in the American colonies, was Adam Smith's *The Wealth of Nations*, which was published in 1776, the year of the Declaration of Independence. Smith was among the first to argue that free markets were more efficient and therefore more productive. He was also one of the first to conclude that monopolies and mercantilism itself constituted what is known as restraint on trade. Okay? Smith's view of the efficiency of the free market as an invisible hand that directs the flow of goods according to, sort of the natural laws of supply and demand, really, exerted wide influence among economists generally, and certainly among kind of classical liberals, and then these days many of whom we would describe as conservatives. Again, among the critical contributions Smith acknowledged that governments make to economic productivity include the development of things like that we characterize as infrastructure, right? Safe roads, protecting roads from bandits, lighthouses that help guide ships into harbors, things that involve the facilitation of goods, building canals. Later on, we would look at railroads and highways. These are the things that Adam Smith said were the proper role of government. Because if you leave those kinds of things to private enterprise, they won't have sufficient incentive to do it. The government, on the other hand, doesn't have to operate simply on the basis of greed. They can operate on the basis of a common good. A road that connects towns is a road that makes it easier for people to get jobs in other places. So these are all things that kind of work to the advantage of the economy overall and works to the advantage of the public generally. So Adam Smith has this argument, and he writes this again in The Wealth of Nations. Private property, public good. I've mentioned Adam Smith was a philosopher and an economist. He's kind of one of the founding members of the classical school of economics. The Wealth of Nations is widely regarded as one of the kind of signal contributions to the modern field of economics. Smith was an early advocate of capitalism and argued again for minimal government intervention in private economic interactions. He talks about a certain propensity in human nature. When you think of that sentence, what does it mean? We're getting back to this sense of, what do people think human beings do, right? And for Adam Smith, he's basically saying that there is a natural tendency for human beings to truck, barter, and exchange one thing or for another. He argues that humanity's almost constant occasion for the help of his brethren, and it is in vain for him to expect it from their benevolence only. This is a famous quotation from The Wealth of Nations. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interests. And so for early liberals like Smith, the idea of Homo sapiens, which refers to, that's Latin for the wise animal, should be amended to Homo pactus, right? Human beings are the bargaining animal, if you will. So nobody but a beggar, according to Smith, chooses to depend chiefly upon the benevolence of his fellow citizens for their sustenance, right? And he is basically saying that most people, given their choice, would work for a living and would seek to acquire things that they could then either trade or barter or exchange for money or something like that. He also argues that there is a natural tendency towards specialization. Individuals' talents incline them to perform tasks that benefit other members of their community. Individuals' skill and diligence results in the surplus produce with which they can exchange with others for the produce they desire. Human differences in natural talent is less than the differences that exist between animals. By nature, a philosopher is not ingenious and disposition half so different from a street porter as a mastiff is from a greyhound, or a greyhound from a spaniel, or this last from a shepherd's dog. And so when you think about it, someone who was good with working wood back in his day might make arrows. They might make enough arrows for themselves, but if they're good at it, they can easily make sufficient arrows that they can sell them. And if the quality of their goods is sufficient, they can attract people who will want to buy their arrows. Likewise, people who are skilled in hunting will hunt to feed themselves, but will oftentimes find themselves successfully killing more animals than they can consume. They can bring those animals to market, which can be sold to a butcher, who can then again sell the meat for sale. Put the meat on sale. Smith was not making an argument about selfishness. Okay, for him, greed is not so good. He pointed to the link between self-interest, properly understood, and moral intuitions like compassion, empathy, and benevolence. We need a certain amount of fellow feeling. We need a certain amount of trust. If you do not trust the people you live around, then you are basically locked in your own little space. So the pursuit of self-interest purely for personal gain and at the expense of others is often corrosive of the public good. Think about it. If you're a homeowner and you hire a contractor to do a job, and you give them a check, like 2/3 of the way through the job, and then they simply walk away. Are you likely to hire that person again? Are you likely to recommend that person to other people? In fact, he's arguing that selfish behavior, that grasping behavior, concerned solely for one's own benefit, is bad for business. Okay? So again, he talks about Adam Smith talks about the three proper functions of government. First, to defend against invasion, to promote justice and maintain public order, and again, to provide certain public works. And again, it's not just those public works that facilitate trade that he's talking about. He's also talking about things like libraries, things like universities that actually expand your fellow inhabitants' capacities to do things. These are very important goods, public works, that increase the productivity of your community. and think about it in these terms. Back in the medieval period, the primary basis for wealth was land. Why? Because most of what you were doing was growing food. Okay, because for the most part, most communities were literally one bad harvest away from famine. Right? Building up the wealth of a community means you are building up the capacity of that community, of that city like Claremore, that state like Oklahoma, or ultimately the United States. You are increasing the capacity of each of those kind of political entities' ability to both maintain their independence, to promote liberty, and also to resist the nature, if you will, to help overcome nature. So liberalism emerges, like I said, in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. It really comes into full flower in the 19th century. And of course, in the 19th century, there were also events that led to the Great Schism within liberalism. So liberalism has at least potentially revolutionary implications. Belief in personal liberty and defense of individual rights certainly had revolutionary implications as we entered the 19th century, which, remember, was right in the middle of the age of Napoleon. And then you had, of course, in 1815, the sort of Napoleon's abdication and ultimate defeat. And then you had the Congress of Vienna, which was a deeply reactionary, kind of reordering of Europe, an attempt to put Humpty Dumpty back together again, if you will. And that really launched a 30-year period of deeply reactionary, deeply conservative politics that was really a cause for a great deal of unhappiness among the peoples of Europe. And it's important to keep in mind, from 1815, that's an important event. That's where you see kind of the discomfiture of the Napoleonic Empire. And then in 1848, which we'll discuss in other contexts, you see a surge of revolutions that take place throughout Europe. These are, again, people basically saying, I am sick and tired. Politics is getting in my way. Okay? So one of the first countries that really has a dynamic change in its economy in this period is, of course, England. They undergo what would become known as the Industrial Revolution. So both the Industrial Revolution and the expansion of the British Empire provided an enormous amount of space for the emergence and the cultivation of liberal ideas. It's important to keep in mind Great Britain was the workshop of the world. You had people working in factories for the first time, and the first generation of people who moved into factories, they found themselves working in absolutely grotesque conditions, working 16-hour days, 7 days a week. Absolute crushing, exhausting work. The emergence of steam power, again, greatly expanded the industrial capacity of England, even as its working class was literally being worked to death. Okay, so industrialization and colonization contributed to the emergence of really sharp economic class divisions within English society, which was already pretty highly segmented. It's noble, the noble classes in England kind of held on to their power really well into the 20th century. And so the dominance of the landed aristocracy, the enclosure movement, which involved basically the nobility seizing common lands for, again, the use to grow sheep on, that was used to harvest wool, that was then used to make clothing in factories. That, again, increasingly was just not an unsatisfactory way of living. And you also had a rising middle class of merchants and professional activities. And those folks, again, were increasingly dissatisfied with what was happening in England at the time. The horrific poverty and the terrible working conditions of Victorian England gave rise to significant reform movements. And of course, pictured on this slide is Charles Dickens, who again wrote many of the tremendous books chronicling Oliver Twist and many of these other books that really highlighted the squalor and the absolute indifference that English society looked at the kind of the dross, if you will, of humanity that the Industrial Revolution was leaving behind. In 1832, you actually had in England the passage of the Reform Bill, which lowered requirements for middle-class males as a voting qualification. That dramatically expanded the franchise, and it made English government far more responsive to the will of working class voters, and that really was instrumental in improving the lives of English people. Another important influence of this period is utilitarianism. Utilitarianism was a philosophical movement. It emerged again in the early decades of the 19th century. It was a reform movement advocating the rationalization of society. Utilitarians stipulated that self-interest was the principal basis for rational action. Utilitarians advanced what is known as a hedonistic moral psychology. Basically, a moral psychology is this sense of which what motivates a person to act. And so, for utilitarians, Jeremy Bentham, who was the kind of founding person of the utilitarian movement, he would say, one, nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. He is essentially saying that sensual feeling is at the heart of all kind of moral psychological calculations. The second, he would say, it is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as determine what we shall do. So he's essentially saying that this is about pleasure and pain. Okay? Now, they didn't have this, they had a more complicated understanding of what constituted pleasure. So it was something involving something more than simple immediate gratification. So they drew a careful distinction between short-term and long-term pleasure. So seeking pleasure as searching for utility. Like a hammer viewing a carpenter viewing a hammer, or an instrument for a musician. For Bentham, the business of government is to promote the happiness of society by punishing and rewarding. So there are two principal kind of utilitarian conclusions about government. One is that government should generally promote the greatest happiness by leaving people alone. Individuals are the best judges of their own self-interest. Utilitarians essentially endorsed the tenets of laissez-faire capitalism. The second aspect of this is that government is not likely to promote the greatest happiness for the greatest number if controlled by a small elite. So most utilitarians believed that everyone should be counted equally. The government should weigh everyone's interests, again, which implies that everyone should have a right to vote, at least by implication. And Bentham certainly supported, Jeremy Bentham certainly supported universal male suffrage with certain reservations, and actually supported the right to vote for women. Another important influence in the formation of liberalism in the 19th century is John Stuart Mill, who at various points in his life described himself as a utilitarian, a socialist, and a liberal. His father was James Mill, who was a colleague of Jeremy Bentham and who really raised him to be like this very brilliant person. So he wrote a book in 1859 called On Liberty, which is still widely read. For Mill, the greatest threat to liberty was the tyranny of the majority, and that the effective constraint on government interventions are the most effective way of securing individual liberty. And again, what he's talking about is constitutionalism, basically rules that govern people in power, saying you cannot use governmental power for such and such ends. So one of the things he talked about was the harm principle. And again, he's basically making the argument. Government has no business regulating access to all alcohol merely on the grounds that drinking harms the drinker. At the same time, government can certainly prohibit drunken driving on the grounds that driving while inebriated poses a threat to others. He likewise drew on Thomas Jefferson in advocating religious tolerance. The legitimate powers of government extend to such acts only when they are injurious to others. It does me no injury for my neighbor to say that there are 20 gods or no God. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. I love that quotation. I've used it before. So in Considerations on Representative Government, written in 1861, he basically, again, argued that representative government was useful for the protection of self-interest. Mill, on the other hand, was convinced that representative government had an educative value and went further. Mill's attitude, again, towards the masses was sort of a limitation on his liberalism. One of Mill's ideas for ensuring that representative government would not succumb to the tyranny of the majority was to grant people with greater educational attainments more votes. Mill reasoned that better educated people were more likely to be enlightened and better informed, and their additional votes would ensure a more sober and moderate government. Most of us today think that that's probably a pathway to very wealthy people becoming, attaining lots and lots of degrees that would give them more voting power. That is sort of the tick in any sort of meritocratic argument, that people with the resources can always game the system. Okay? Let's look into another one of his writings. This is from On Liberty. It's called Liberty and Individuality. So again, he talks about the harm principle. And in essence, the harm principle is this: the sole end for which mankind are warranted, individually or collectively, in interfering with the liberty of action of any other of their number is self-protection. The only purpose for which power can rightfully be exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. His own good, either physical or moral, is not sufficient warrant. Over himself, over his body and mind, the individual is sovereign. Now, he immediately qualifies this rather dramatic declaration, noting that the statement applies to human beings in the maturity of their faculties. He also notes that despotism is a legitimate mode of government in dealing with barbarians. In other words, he is captured within the 19th century milieu that says that those countries that England and other European powers had colonized and were dominating, that was for their own good, right? So again, how do we know when such a level of civilization has been achieved? But it's important to note that he's basically saying, even if a person is behaving in an evidently self-destructive way, there are limits to what we can do to save them from themselves, right? Locke would talk about the power of remonstration, right? I think Mill would have agreed. You have the right and the power to beg that person to stop their self-destructive behavior. You do not have a sanction to take that person up and to rob them of their autonomy. That is, again, the essence of the harm principle. So what is the appropriate region of human liberty? He talks about liberty of the inward domain of consciousness. What does he mean by that? He's basically talking about your beliefs and, to some extent, your belief formation. We have to have a right to say what it is that we think is important in how we understand the world. We also have the right to liberty of tastes and pursuits, right? There's a Latin phrase, de gustibus non est disputandum, and it basically means in matters of taste, there can be no judge, right? There can be no dispute. You don't have a right to say, I don't like rap, therefore you shouldn't like rap, or certain forms of rap, or whatever, or any other kind of art. Whatever it is that you like is up to you, so long as your tastes are not harming other people. Jeffrey Epstein has been in the news quite a bit. He had a taste for raping underage girls. That's not something that we need to tolerate. That is doing harm to those young girls who were not in a position to consent to what he was asking them to do. The third area that he talks about is the liberty to unite for any purpose not involving harm to others. Again, that is the essence of what our First Amendment protects, which is the freedom of association. He also discusses the importance of liberty of thought and discussion. And this famous quote really kind of highlights it. If all mankind, minus one, were of one opinion, and only one person were of the contrary opinion, mankind would be no more justified in silencing that one person than he, if he had the power, would be justified in silencing mankind. In essence, again, this is an argument for tolerance of saying, again, so long as the person's speech is not actually harming a person, they have a right to hold on to that belief. We should always tolerate a certain amount of eccentricity. He offers four distinct defenses for this idea of freedom of expression. One, a suppressed idea may actually prove to be true. Two, even if a suppressed opinion is in an error, it may contain some portion of the truth. Even if received opinion is the whole truth, refusing to accept challenges to opinion would be converted to prejudice. The fourth is a quotation. The meaning of the doctrine itself will be in danger of being lost or enfeebled and deprived of its vital effect on the character and conduct, the dogma becoming a mere formal profession. Again, if we don't understand why we believe certain things, it creates a real challenge. Think about, again, the efficacy of vaccinations. Science has demonstrated that certain vaccines have been highly effective at suppressing diseases which have killed people for millennia. Things like measles, smallpox, rubella. Now you have in Florida, the Florida Surgeon General basically saying that they're not going to have any vaccine requirements anymore. They're not going to mandate vaccines. He's arguing that it's an offense to God to compel parents to vaccinate their children prior to them going to school. This, to me, is a stunning abrogation of the public health responsibilities of the Department of Public Health in Florida. We've already seen in situations, in communities, where parents have used a religious objection to getting their children vaccinated for measles. We have seen measles outbreaks. Children have died of measles in the 21st century because of this argument that nobody should have to take a shot unless they want it. Well, nobody wants to take a shot. You take a shot because it protects you from worse. He talks about the importance of cultivating genius. Again, he follows Alexis de Tocqueville's concerns about mass society and about the idea of conformity being the driving, orienting theme of democracy. Mill argues that originality is the one thing which unoriginal minds cannot feel the use of. He continues, I am not countenancing the sort of hero worship which applauds the strong man of genius for forcibly seizing on the government of the world and making it do his bidding in spite itself. He's basically saying that eccentricity has always abounded when and where strength of character has abounded. The amount of eccentricity in society has generally been proportional to the amount of genius, mental vigor, and moral courage which it contained. The despotism of custom is everywhere the standing hindrance to human advancement. And so he's saying we should tolerate and indeed cultivate the eccentric mind. Eccentricity has always abounded where strength of character has abounded. The despotism of custom is everywhere the standing hindrance to human advancement. So well into the 19th century, liberalism is a fairly coherent body of thought. It is existing alongside of other ideologies. The barriers between and among these ideologies is more porous than we have always been prepared to admit. Within liberalism, however, one important thing that begins to happen around the middle to the latter couple of decades of the 19th century is that you see the emergence of a great schism within liberalism between classical liberalism and welfare liberalism. The divisions within liberalism, again, emerged in response to fundamental social and economic change, industrialization, urbanization, and economic transformation kind of pushed this distinction between and among liberals. Where neoclassical liberals worried about the concentration of political power, welfare liberals argued that government could be a force for good in seeking to lessen or at least ameliorate the worst consequences of poverty. The neoclassical perspective is really captured within the idea of social Darwinism. Now remember, if you know Darwin was a biologist, he's the one who came up with a theory of natural selection and a theory of evolution, that people, that animals evolved to survive. Social Darwinism takes that and applies it to human beings and basically argues that the survival of the fittest should be the dominant mode of evaluating people and what government owes to communities. People like Herbert Spencer, who was a big advocate of social Darwinism, believed that nature selected certain people for success and condemned others to failure, a kind of secularized Calvinism. Social Darwinism provided, again, a justification for colonization, that these people were simply not good enough to prevent us from taking them over, therefore they're obviously inferior to us on a civilizational level, and we have an obligation. The white man's burden was sort of the watchword of social Darwinists. Spencer and other neoclassical liberals favored a night watchman state whose primary mandate was to protect individuals and their property, which just so happens to be people like Herbert Spencer, people with money, people that lived in mansions, people who didn't want people breaking into their yards, breaking into their homes, and taking their stuff. A good illustration of this kind of perspective comes from the American sociologist William Graham Sumner, who wrote a book, According to the Fitness of Things. He was an American sociologist at Yale. He was an advocate of social Darwinism. He was also an advocate of laissez-faire capitalism. His study of the power of social norms, which he described as folkways, led him to conclude that government-led social reforms were always doomed to failure. He was a leading intellectual during the Gilded Age, and he exerted a major influence within American conservatism. And when you read him directly, you get the sense of how he has influenced people, because he was an incredibly provocative writer. He wrote in a sort of insulting way, both against those people who advocated social reforms and those people who were the object of those reforms. He believed that the poor were poor for a reason, that they were selected to be moved out of existence, that they did not deserve any sort of support or protection. So for William Graham Sumner, he basically made the argument, everyone has one social duty: to take care of themselves. Your job is to make money, to care for your family, to ensure that there is food on the table, to ensure that your wife and your children are well clothed, and that you are maintaining your social status within your community. The two problems that emerge with people when they mind other people's business is that they get distracted of taking care of themselves, and two, they become, a word he uses, impertinent. Impertinence is an old-fashioned word whose meaning may not be clear to this generation, but in the late 19th century it was very commonly invoked to keep people within their social station. To be impertinent was to push the boundaries of good taste. And so for him, minding one's own business meant first and foremost staying out of his business. So he describes, again, the person that is most harmed by social reformers, and that is that you're forcing working people to pay for them. Almost all legislative effort to prevent vice is really protective of vice. It's one of these paradoxes that if you read Plato enough, you see the, kind of the word games involved. According to Sumner, a drunkard in the gutter is just where he ought to be, according to the fitness and tendency of things. Nature has set up upon him the process of decline and dissolution by which she removes things which have survived their usefulness. In essence, this is a man describing other human beings as useless, as beneath his attention. So the schism is on the one hand between those people, and it's important to keep in mind the intellectual milieu in which people like William Graham Sumner are operating. After the Civil War, you had a period of Reconstruction where, again, the Union attempted to occupy militarily the southern states and to change their society, to move them away from being an aristocratic, slave-holding society to becoming a more, society more open to Republican ideas and democratic thought. That just utterly failed. And was utterly, ultimately abandoned in 1877. That exerted a powerful influence over American intellectual thought in the late 19th century. When you read the works, the great intellectual works of those periods, there is a sense of just fatalism, that there was no point, that we just had 600,000 people slaughtered to no real end. And people like William Graham Sumner was basically collaborating with that, basically saying, yes, there is no point to social reform. There is no point in government attempting to make people's lives better. And so you begin to see the emergence of, on the one hand, attitudes like that among liberals, people who, again, found social Darwinism to be a persuasive way of looking at the world. And then you had people that were increasingly saying, no, in fact, we do believe in autonomy, and we believe that autonomy can be expanded, that more people can have greater control over their lives. And these are the folks that today we would describe as welfare liberals. Now, it's important to keep in mind, and we'll discuss this more in later presentations, the welfare state really emerged as a conservative approach to the challenges of governance in the modern era, governing industrial societies, especially in Germany and in England. Germany just became a unified state in 1871, I believe. And conservatives like the German Chancellor Bismarck, Otto von Bismarck, who was instrumental in winning the wars that led to German unification, basically they faced a real fear. To people like Bismarck, the greatest threat to the German state was socialism, which we'll discuss more in a couple of presentations. Bismarck viewed welfare as a way of weaning German factory workers away from socialists like Karl Marx. So the birth of the welfare state coincided also with the expansion of voting rights throughout much of Europe. So there is an important distinction to be made, and we'll talk more about this next week. There is an important distinction to be made between welfare liberalism and socialism. A lot of conservatives in contemporary discourse collapse the term. They basically describe all liberals as Marxists or socialists or whatever. Welfare liberals generally accept the legitimacy of the marketplace and support government interventions to protect equality of opportunity. Most socialists view capitalism as fundamentally immoral and believe government should be empowered to make far more dramatic interventions in the interests of equality than most liberals are prepared to accept. There is a reason why consistently Bernie Sanders is sort of sitting at the outward edge of American, the leftward edge of American political discourse. Okay? Most liberals would probably agree with Bernie Sanders on certain of the fundamental criticisms he offers of contemporary society. But they would take issue with the ends that Sanders would advocate, to the program of action, if you will. So the liberal origins, again, of welfarism emerge in sort of the horrors of the Industrial Revolution. Welfare liberals advocated the removal of obstacles to growth and the development of individuals as fully formed individuals. So they're looking at improving workplace conditions, giving people more time to themselves, reduction of the work week, but also access to education, so that they would have skills that they could do something beyond simply working in a factory. So implicit in the welfare liberals' idea is the recognition that modernity intensifies the challenges presented to individuals, the challenges of poverty, of illness, of prejudice, of ignorance. And so you have the British social reformer and philosopher T.H. Green, who argued again that on the one hand you have this notion of negative freedom, that government should not be intruding into people's private lives. At the same time, and a little bit paradoxically, there is also a positive duty to basically assure that people have meaningful opportunities. So welfare liberals like T.H. Green advocated investing in public education, hospitals, public aid to the needy, and improvements to worker safety. Keep in mind, there really wasn't a healthcare system, even in industrial societies, until well into the 20th century. The United States really, when the great influenza of 1920 and 21 hit the United States and killed 600,000 people, they were just warehousing people in beds, and because they simply lacked the capacity to manage that. It wasn't until 18 years later that the federal government basically began investing in the creation of a healthcare infrastructure. Many of the hospitals that exist today were built because of those initial investments on the part of the federal government. So let's address for a minute T.H. Green and the idea of liberalism and positive freedom. So again, he views freedom as that greatest of blessings. When we speak of freedom, we should consider carefully what we mean. What we don't mean, what is it that we don't mean when we reference freedom? So for Green, freedom is not simply the absence of restraint or compulsion, nor is it the liberty to do simply as we like without regard to what it is that we like doing. Nor is freedom valued when the liberty of one person comes at the loss or diminution of liberty of others. So for Green, when we speak of freedom as something to be so highly prized, we mean a positive power or capacity of doing or enjoying something that we do or enjoy in common with others. So he draws the contrast between the wandering savage, who really has no master, has no real agenda, simply wanders the earth, feeding himself however he may. So a wandering savage, and again, this is how people in the 19th century talked, has no master and no one can tell him or her what to do. Yet we do not count the wandering savage as really free, because the freedom of savagery is not strength but weakness. It is a parlous freedom because it is literally hand to mouth. Your ability to be free is chained by your ability to stay alive and the fact that you basically lack many of the means to do so. You are constantly scrabbling for food. He is not a slave of man, but he is a slave of nature. So for Green, and you'll hear this elsewhere too, the first steps toward freedom is the submission to society. And that is the first step towards the full exercise of the faculties individuals possess. This is, again, this innate sense in which many liberals, not all, but many liberals recognize that we're free so that we can do what we want to do, but we should want to do things that are good for our community. The highest developments of a single person is not an advance towards true freedom if it is founded on a refusal of the same opportunity to others. The sin of civilizations of antiquity was their reliance on slavery. So what does T.H. Green mean by this idea of positive freedom? All forms of freedom ought to be directed to an end. What does he mean by that? The end involves the liberation of the powers of all individuals equally for contributions to a common good. No one has a right to do what he will with his own in such a way as to contravene this end. The mutual interest in ensuring everyone has the free use and enjoyment of their possessions, so long as that freedom on the part of one does not interfere with the freedom on the part of others. And so you'll hear certain people, like Robert Nozick in the 20th century, would make the argument, he was a libertarian, that you could be a slave. You could say, if you don't value freedom, if you don't feel like you have the mental capacity to be truly autonomous, and you want to be placed in the service of someone else, you should be able to sign a contract to do that. Green in the 19th century would say, even voluntary slavery has to be rejected as the perfect illustration of a bad contract. Okay? So again, it's important to keep in mind. Think about, people that, in the 19th century, mining was an enormously lucrative and important activity. In fact, some of the most highly paid people in America's working classes were miners, but they were living incredibly dangerous lives. They were oftentimes going miles underground, clearing out coal or copper or whatever it was they were mining in incredibly dangerous conditions. They were paid fairly well, but the conditions were enormously dangerous. Green and other welfare liberals would basically make the argument that they're being forced into a bad contract because they're being provided more money than they otherwise could make, but they're being put in a position where they're risking their lives on a day-to-day basis. Why in the world would anyone agree to that kind of a contract? Likewise, you sign up to work in a factory. You're working 16 hours a day. You may get Sunday off, 1 day a week off. You're working 70, 80 hours a week. And oftentimes you're not making sufficient money to save and set aside so that your children can have better clothes or that you can send your kids to a better school. Is that a contract that is worthy of both ends of, both the person negotiating and the person that's signing on to it? And so again, even voluntary slavery is a bad deal. We think about that in terms of other forms. We talk about victimless crimes, things like prostitution. From a liberal perspective, on the one hand, you would make the argument, and there have been liberals out there that have basically said if someone is prepared to offer in contract to offer their body for certain services, that should be tolerated. For Green, who was a kind of minister of sorts, he would basically say, no, this is a bad contract, and oftentimes it is done, out of circumstantial, challenges. The person lacks the means to make a living; they lack the education. This is a fundamental problem that confronts a lot of low-income Americans. How do I make sufficient money to get through the day, much less to be able to set money aside and get to a better place economically? So as it relates to labor, positive freedom means that while labor is an exchangeable commodity, no one should be compelled to work under conditions that make it impossible for the laborer to become a free contributor to the social good. So the 19th century factory worker that was literally working continually, that's an unfair contract, simply because you're leaving that person no opportunities to improve themselves. If you're working from 7 in the morning until 8 or 9 at night, you barely have time to eat and fall asleep, much less take a correspondence course at night. And so Green is basically making the argument, working people to death is a harm. It is a public harm. Every injury to the health of an individual is a public injury. So again, for a welfare liberal like Green, he is basically making the argument, no, we are not isolated individuals whose sole concern is to look after the care of themselves and their immediate families. And he's arguing for the need for legislation to provide for general freedom to enable all citizens to make the best of themselves. And so for a welfare liberal, the argument is that you absolutely have to have the latitude, and government should be investing in the ability of each individual to make the best of themselves. And so as individuals, our search for autonomy is a collective sort of end. One thing I teach a class in comparative politics, and I talk a lot about Japanese culture. One thing that they do, they have a very low percentage of their population that earns like more than $500,000 a year. I think only about 10%, and only about 10% of Japanese earn less than $60,000 a year. That has to do with their culture. Their culture basically says, we want to pull everyone along. They have strong cultural norms, in personally perfecting everything that it is that they do in life, whether it be, as a sushi chef or as a musician or, whatever it is, as a business person. They feel strongly motivated to try and be their best self, and again, because they need to be seen being their best self. Now, I don't know that Japanese culture translates, I don't believe it does, frankly, to the American way of doing things. We are simply far more individualistic than a society where the motto is the tall nail gets hammered down. We have a culture that really exaggerates personal achievement and personal merit and things like that. But nevertheless, it's an argument that we are social creatures. We do have social obligations to one another, at least from Green's perspective. So Green would basically make the argument that government should act as a powerful friend, which again is a classic 19th century way of looking at things. So while Green would prefer to live in a world where everyone spontaneously did the right thing, it is the business of the state to ensure everyone has access to things like health care and education. And he's basically making an argument about the limitations of autonomy. He's saying that many of us simply live, too busy a life to be able to attend to all the things that we need to be able to do. How can we pick, the right insurance in a field where, everything is so opaque, right? Where what you get from a particular insurance plan is really hard to read the fine print and know exactly what you're getting. Individuals, to protect their families and ensure their education, are not harmed by laws requiring that such responsibilities be met. He's basically, think about, he's kind of inverting what Sumner was saying, right? He's basically saying that even if you're doing the right thing, you're not harmed by the taxes that you pay. You're not meaningfully harmed by the taxes that you pay that, to ensure that the rest of your community has the same kinds of resources you have available to you. The laws ensuring decent education and safe housing for heads of household to do better in other respects of their household's collective well-being, that's simply a good thing, right? If if there are laws on the books that ensure a decent education for children and safe housing, that gives heads of households more time to work on other aspects of their life, of their household life. Think about it again from the perspective of a head of household. If you have to work 80 hours a week, can you be a good father or mother? This is a balancing act that we're constantly, trying to negotiate. My wife complains to me a lot that you are the job. You spend too much time grading, too much time doing all this other stuff. And to an extent, she may be right. Maybe I spend too much time in the evening trying to grade. But at the same time, to be a good professor, you have to be able to turn work around quickly and let people know, whether you think that what they're doing needs to be improved or not. So he asks a really important question. Can we expect such things to be done through benevolence or enlightened self-interest? When you go back to William Graham Sumner, he's saying this is the social mores. Look after your own business. And yet, even in his day, many people were simply not able to look after their own business because they're being worked to death and they're basically being exploited for their labor. And so, for Sumner, he's just saying we can rely on this folkway that everyone's supposed to mind their own business. And everyone that doesn't deserve my consideration. Green is basically saying that's a really morally cramped way of approaching politics and governance. That we should be prepared to do better. That we should understand that when we look out for one another, we are putting ourselves in a better place. Collectively, not just us, not just our household. Our community does better. There's this idea that we talk about a lot in both sociology and political science. It's called social capital. This was something that was used extensively by Robert Putnam in a book called Bowling Alone. And I often, when I teach my government class, I tell kids, what's a good way of measuring social capital? And one way I think of is, how many sidewalks are there in a community? How easy is it for someone who doesn't have access to a car to negotiate a community? How much public transit is there available to people? These are the indicators that social capital is being invested in making a place livable. Are there parks, in your community? Is there a dog park where you can walk your dog and have your dog play with other dogs? Because dogs get lonely if they live alone. Do you have these sorts of resources available to you? And if you go to some communities, you can walk pretty easily. You go to others, and it almost is like they're trying to inhibit people from walking. I once had to put my car in the shop, and I had them drive me to work, and I wasn't going to be able to get my car until later in the day. And so I just walked home because I don't live very far from my house. And my wife, when she heard that, because she's lived in Oklahoma and in Claremore a lot longer, because I think I was like only here for about 5 years. I'd only been here for about 5 years. She was like, Ken, you can't do that. People are going to think you're crazy if they see you walking. And I thought that was incredible. And it struck me, that there is this sense in which there are lots and lots of people who basically are organized solely along what happens to themselves and to their families. And what does that do to the communities around them when that's all that it is that you're worried about? And this is ultimately what revolves around issues related to liberalism and to these contending visions of liberalism. I think you can make the argument, and I think it's a fairly reasonable argument, that our two political parties are really just arguing about contending visions of liberalism and what it means to place a value on personal autonomy. And the interesting thing is that both political parties are prepared to intervene in different ways, in ways that the other side believes are harmful to individual autonomy. So on the one hand, you've got Democrats who are effectively the party of welfare liberalism, saying we should have higher rates of taxation on the wealthy so that we can invest in programs that make it easier for low-income Americans to extricate themselves from poverty and to rise up into the middle class. And on the other side, you have Republicans who are basically the party of classical liberalism, saying that high rates of taxation are harmful to the people being taxed and that redistribution is effectively a waste of time. That those people who are low income are typically low income because of decisions that they have made. That's how I see it. I mean, that's the contention between broadly the two visions of liberalism offered in America. And of course, you've got Bernie Sanders over, in his little area, basically saying free college, free health care, way higher taxes on the wealthy. And then you have libertarians, who we'll talk about in our next presentation, who are basically saying, I don't even think that we even need government. We could pay people to protect us. We could pay people to put out fires. We could pay people to build roads. Every act should be a voluntary act, and any act that's not voluntary is coerced, and coercion is always wrong from a libertarian perspective. Think about that. What are the consequences of that viewpoint? That any form of coercion is equally bad, equally subject to moral condemnation. We'll find out when we get to our discussion of socialism. One of the early socialists, Pierre Proudhon, said that property is theft. Well, for for libertarians, they would say taxation is theft. And again, we'll see in later versions of libertarianism that these folks view the state, government itself, as the antagonist from within their ideological worldview. What are the implications of that for politics? It creates real difficulty in governing when you have these kinds of schismatic forces that basically require you, like William Graham Sumner, to dismiss large swaths of humanity as unworthy of your attention. So when we come back, we will continue our discussion of liberalism. We'll get into the 20th century, into the great movements that produced the administrative state and the welfare state in the United States, and the libertarian critique that has carried forward into the 20th century in effectively saying that things like welfarism are fundamentally unjust. I'll see you next time.